team of American researchers working in the high mountains of Turkey have uncovered what appear to be hidden tunnels similar to the descriptions of the biblical account of Noah's Ark.
Imagine these mountains millennia ago, submerged by floods, and in this beautiful biblical landscape named in the Old Testament, the shape of a ship.
For thousands of years, the world has argued about whether Noah's Ark was real. Pulpits insisted it was. Universities laughed it off. Explorers chased it into snowstorms and came home with nothing but frostbite and stories. And then, after all the noise, a quiet international team walked up a slope in eastern Turkey, drilled into a boat-shaped ridge that locals had been pointing at for 1,000 years, and lowered a camera into the dark. What the lens picked up on the way down is the reason every researcher in that tent went silent.
New research shared with today hints at that extraordinary conclusion. Believers have been drawn to this site in Turkey, close to the Iranian border, since it mysteriously emerged after an earthquake in the 1940s.
And it is not what anyone expected. The ridge nobody forgot. The Durapanar site sits on a volcanic slope south of Mount Ararat, 500 feet long, pointed at one end, blunt at the other, looking from the air like a massive ship that sank into the earth and was left there to fossilize. For decades, mainstream science had a tidy answer for it: erosion, mud flow, geology playing a trick. The locals never accepted that answer. One of them was an elder named Rashid, a shepherd from a hamlet on the lower slopes, whose grandfather had pointed at the ridge when Rashid was a boy, and told him, in a voice that did not invite questions, that the shape in the earth was older than memory and that it had a name nobody alive remembered how to pronounce.
Chapter 6 of Genesis, it talks about a 300-cubit long boat. And that, if you use the Egyptian cubit, is 515 feet long, or about 157 meters. And that's exactly the length of this boat-shaped object.
Rashid is in his 70s now. He has watched outsiders come and go his entire life. Soldiers in the 1960s, American explorers in the 1970s, television crews in the 1990s. Each group climbed up, took their photographs, made their pronouncements, and left. None of them ever brought the kind of machines the new team has brought. The new team arrived with ground-penetrating radar trucks, three-dimensional subsurface imaging arrays, and soil analysis kits that did not exist the last time anyone official looked. They pointed all of it at the ridge, and the man with his hands in his jacket pockets watched the first return come back across his screen. He had been expecting noise.
He's flying over basically the middle of nowhere when he sees a startling and unusual formation amongst the rocks below, which of course, he photographs.
What the radar saw first. Underground, nature is messy. You expect chaos, random layers, tilted strata, fractures running in every direction. That is what natural formations look like on a scan. That is what the geophysicist on the ridge had been trained for 20 years to expect. What came back instead were lines, long, straight, parallel lines, running the length of the formation, sharp 90-degree angles, layers that looked stacked rather than crushed. He ran it again. Different angle, different settings. He was not trying to confirm the pattern. He was trying to make it go away. Geologists by training, by temperament, by professional reflex, want a natural explanation for everything they see. A natural explanation is the safest finding any researcher can deliver. The lines did not go away, and the lines were only the first thing the scans found. Deeper down, layered beneath the surface lines, the radar caught something the team had not even thought to look for.
Despite what the Bible says, there is actually zero archaeological evidence for Noah, an ark, or a flood.
Repeating structures, symmetrical divisions, compartments, the kind of pattern that, when you see it on a scan, almost never comes from rock. The geophysicist stepped back from the laptop. Someone on the team asked him what he was seeing. He did not answer right away. When he finally did, what he said was not a conclusion. It was a question. He asked whether anyone had ever measured the dimensions of the formation against the dimensions described in the ancient texts. The numbers that went quiet, they had not properly, not against the new radar data. So they did it that afternoon. They pulled the internal measurements off the scans. They cross-referenced them against the proportional dimensions recorded in the book of Genesis for the vessel that landed in the mountains of Ararat, length, width, internal divisions. The kind of comparison that researchers run, knowing going in, that the numbers are not going to match. The numbers matched. Not approximately, not loosely. Close enough that one researcher reportedly said the proportions gave him chills. The kind of close that, when mathematicians see it in a coded message, tells them the message was not random noise. There was a designer behind these numbers, or there was the most precise geological accident in the recorded history of the planet. The team did not announce anything. They turned to the soil. What the dirt was hiding. Soil chemistry is one of the most honest sciences there is. Dirt does not have an agenda.
Is fascinated by stories, myths, and legends from the Holy Grail to Noah's Ark, and we're forever trying to find proof that these things exist.
The team took samples from inside the formation and from the surrounding terrain to compare them. The two should have been nearly identical. They were not even close. The soil inside the ridge contained dramatically higher levels of organic material, traces of carbon, chemical signatures consistent with something that had once been alive and had slowly decayed in place. The mineral content was off, the acidity was off. Even the plants growing directly on top of the site looked different from the plants growing 20 feet away. Shorter, sparser, as if the ground beneath them was carrying something the surrounding earth was not. The lead soil chemist read the results twice, then a third time. He walked outside the tent and stood looking up at the ridge for a long minute before he came back in. He did not say anything dramatic. He just asked the team to run the test again, on a fresh sample, from a different depth. The second test came back the same. Rashid, the village elder, was sitting on a rock nearby watching all of it. When the chemist walked past him, Rashid said something quietly in Turkish that nobody on the team caught the first time. They asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. The translator looked uncomfortable for a second, and then she said what he had said. He had said that his grandfather already knew, that every grandfather here already knew, and that it was kind for the machines to finally agree with them. If this story has pulled you in this far, take a second and subscribe to the channel before we go any deeper. We dig into these long-buried mysteries every week, and the locals around the Durapinar Ridge have been pointing at this thing for 1,000 years, while the rest of the world looked the other way. The radar is finally catching up to what they have been saying all along, and the next stretch of this story is where the catching up turns into something nobody expected. The man who wouldn't quit. Long before the modern team arrived with their radar trucks, one man had already spent 22 years on that mountain, and his name still divides archaeology today. Ron Wyatt was not a scientist. He was a nurse anesthetist from Tennessee. He had no archaeology degree, no academic credentials, no formal training in any of the disciplines you would normally need to investigate a site like this. What he had was a copy of Life magazine, a photograph that haunted him, and a stubbornness that bordered on obsession. The photograph showed the Durapinar formation. Most people who saw it shrugged and turned the page. Wyatt could not turn the page. He stared at that picture and asked himself a question that would consume the rest of his life.
We believe that God has preserved in the earth and under the seas remains of the major events discussed in the Bible. Physical remains, chemical remains.
What if the most famous vessel in human history was sitting right there, embedded in the earth, waiting for someone to take it seriously? Starting in the late 1970s, Wyatt began making trips to Turkey. Not one trip, not two. Trip after trip after trip, year after year, for more than 2 decades. He climbed that mountain in his 50s. He climbed it in his 60s. He climbed it when his health was failing. He climbed it when funding ran out and he was paying for the flights himself. And he kept finding things. Petrified wood in patterns he believed matched ancient ship timbers. Metal fragments shaped like brackets and rivets, embedded in the soil where wood would have once been joined together. Rib-like rock formations that, to his eye, traced the curved outline of a massive hull. Geometric patterns under the ground that he insisted could not be natural. To Wyatt, every trip turned up more pieces of the same puzzle, and every piece pointed the same direction. His supporters called him God's archaeologist. His critics called him something less polite. Mainstream scientists tore into his work. They pointed out fairly that he had no formal training. They argued his metal fragments could be ordinary mineral concretions. They insisted his rib formations were the result of erosion patterns common to volcanic mud flows. They accused him of seeing what he wanted to see. To his supporters, Wyatt was a martyr to academic gatekeeping. They argued he was being dismissed, not because his evidence was weak, but because his conclusions were inconvenient. Wyatt died in 1999, still convinced he was right. He never lived to see the morning the radar trucks rolled up the mountain road. He never saw the look on the geophysicist's face. He never heard the soil chemist ask for a third sample. He spent the last 22 years of his life pointing at a ridge that the world refused to look at.
The story of the flood indicates that the ark was a free-floating object on an earth covered with water, and that it came to rest in some mountains.
And he went into the ground believing nobody ever would. The stones he had pointed at were still standing, and the stones were the next clue. The anchor stones nobody can explain. Scattered around the perimeter of the formation, planted in the soil for as long as anyone in the surrounding villages can remember, are massive stone slabs. Some of them stand over 20 feet tall. Every single one of them has a perfectly drilled hole carved through the top. Rashid's family has stories about the stones. They do not know who made them. Their oldest tales cannot reach far enough back to remember. What the tales do remember is that the stones have always been there. The shape of them, and the placement of them, and the holes in them all suggest one specific purpose. They look exactly like the anchor stones used by ancient mariners to stabilize a massive vessel against powerful currents. The kind of stones you would tie to a ship to keep it from breaking apart in a flood of unimaginable scale. And they are not arranged randomly. Researchers mapping the area notice that several of the largest slabs are positioned in a rough arc, almost as if they had once been tethered to something at the center, something that, when the waters rose, needed to be held in place by every cable a desperate crew could attach to it. Erosion does not arrange stones in arcs. Wind does not drill perfect holes through 20-foot slabs of basalt. Whoever placed those stones knew exactly what they were doing, and the question of who has a longer answer than anyone in the surrounding valleys realized. The flood story that will not die. There is a detail about this story that almost nobody stops to think about. The tale of a world-destroying flood is not the property of one religion. It surfaces again and again in close to 200 separate cultures across every inhabited continent. A great flood, a righteous man, a vessel that survives, animals preserved, a new beginning. The same story, in tribes that had no possible way of borrowing it from each other. At the British Museum, researchers translated a Babylonian tablet describing a massive circular arc with measurements so precise that a modern team in India actually built a replica using the ancient instructions. The thing floated, a 4,000-year-old set of shipbuilding instructions, scribbled into clay by someone who had never heard the word engineering, produced a working boat in the 21st century. That is not the kind of detail that ends up in mythology by accident. That is the kind of detail that ends up in mythology when somebody, somewhere, actually built the original. The math on that kind of coincidence does not work. Either every isolated culture invented the same oddly specific story by chance, which strains credibility past the breaking point, or something actually happened, which leaves the team on the ridge with a question they did not sign up for. If the flood stories are echoes of a real event, and if the boat-shaped ridge in eastern Turkey holds the kind of structured material the radar keeps insisting it holds, then the next step is not another scan. The next step is going inside.
According to the Bible, he was a great man of faith because God said he's going to destroy the world with water, the whole world, and Noah had to believe that. There was no evidence that this would happen.
The Cold War whisper. Before the modern team came back, there was one more chapter the records had almost forgotten. During the Cold War, American spy satellites photographed Mount Ararat repeatedly. The region sat near the Soviet border, so the imagery was a matter of national security. Rumors leaked out almost immediately. A boat-shaped object, frozen high on the slopes. Tabloids claimed the Central Intelligence Agency was sitting on proof. When some of the imagery was eventually declassified, mainstream analysts looked at it and concluded the object was a trick of light on a glacier, a rock formation seen from the wrong angle. Maybe they were right. The Durupiner team is not looking at Ararat anyway. They are looking at the ridge in the soil, miles to the south, sitting in plain view of anyone who cared to climb up to it for as long as humans have lived in these valleys. And by the spring of the second field season, they had decided they were going to drill. Scientists finally entered. This is the part the team has been most careful about, because what came back from inside the formation is the part that, if it holds up, changes everything. The drilling did not happen all at once. They mapped the safest access points using the radar data. They chose locations where the structured patterns were deepest and the surface was most stable. They lowered a specialized borehole camera, the kind designed for inspecting underground pipes and tight cavities, on a long cable threaded through a narrow channel cut into the ridge. The first thing the lens saw was darkness. The second thing the lens saw was an edge, a straight edge, a defined corner where two surfaces met at an angle no random rockfall produces.
Right now, this is bird's eye view, and you can see this is kind of the bow of what we believe to be a ship structure, and this is the backside of it. And then this is the limestone structure that they believe this boat got impaled on as it came down the mudslide.
The camera operator paused the descent. The geophysicist, watching the feed from the surface tent, stood up and asked quietly for the camera to be rotated. The third thing the lens saw was a space, not a void carved by water. A space with definition, with apparent walls, with dimensions that, when measured against the radar map, lined up with the compartment patterns the scans had already detected, repeating structural rhythms, sharply defined separations, configurations that did not look thrown together by water and time, but arranged, almost as if something inside the ridge had been built rather than buried. The camera kept descending, more edges, more compartments. The lens caught what looked like a horizontal divider crossing the field of view at a regular interval, and then another one below it, and then another below that, as if it were passing through stacked levels. Each level looked similar to the one above. None of them looked like the inside of a rock. The feed went on for several minutes before anyone in the tent said anything. The geophysicist had moved closer to the monitor at some point and was watching the screen with his hand flat against his mouth. The soil chemist had come into the tent and was standing behind him. Neither of them spoke. The camera operator, a younger researcher who had run hundreds of borehole inspections in pipelines and mine shafts and old wells, it did the only thing he knew how to do in that moment. He kept the cable steady, and he kept the descent slow, and he kept the camera looking forward. Rashid was standing just outside the tent flap when the operator finally pulled the camera back to the surface. He did not look at the screen. He looked at the geophysicist, who had not moved from where he was standing, and he asked the translator a single question. The translator turned to the geophysicist and said gently that Rashid wanted to know if the machines had finally seen what his grandfather had told him was there. The geophysicist did not answer for a long time. When he did, he chose his words with extraordinary care. He said the team had not confirmed anything yet. He said they needed more drilling, more imaging, more independent verification. He said no responsible researcher could call the formation by the name everyone was thinking. Then he said more quietly that whatever was inside that ridge was not nothing. The ridge is still there. The Durup in our site has been sitting on that slope for as long as humans have written down stories about floods. It outlasted Roman emperors. It outlasted Ottoman sultans. It outlasted the Cold War. It outlasted Ron Wyatt, who climbed it until his body gave out. And it outlasted every team of skeptics who came up the mountain to dismiss it and went back down the mountain a little less certain than they arrived. What makes this round different from every previous round is not faith. It is not folklore. It is data, layered radar imagery, comparative soil chemistry, three-dimensional subsurface mapping, borehole camera footage that can be played back, frame by frame, in any laboratory on the planet. Evidence that can be tested and retested and challenged by anyone willing to climb up there and try. The team has not closed the case. They are too careful to close the case. They will keep drilling. They will keep scanning. They will publish slowly, the way real researchers publish, with every claim measured against every counterclaim. But the ridge is no longer a rumor. The grandfathers of the village were not imagining things. Ron Wyatt was not chasing ghosts up that mountain for 22 years. The Cold War rumors were not entirely smoke. The Babylonian tablet at the British Museum was not a fairy tale dressed up as engineering. Something is buried inside that boat-shaped slope in eastern Turkey. Something structured, something the surrounding soil still carries the chemical memory of. Something the camera lens caught in its first descent and could not unsee. Whatever name we end up giving it, that name has been waiting in the mountain for a very long time. and the people in the surrounding valleys have been quietly carrying it forward in stories the rest of us were not ready to hear. The mountain has been holding its secret for a very long time. The data is finally starting to speak. It is not nothing. If you made it this far, hit subscribe and stick with the channel. We chase the long-buried mysteries the rest of the world has stopped looking at, the ones the locals have been pointing at for generations, while the experts look the other way. There is more coming out of that mountain. We will be there when it does, and I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe the team is closing in on the real thing, or is this just another chapter in the long history of false alarms? The mountain is listening.